Hey, welcome to the 70 times 7 podcast. My name's DJ, and we got Pastor Danny with us. It is good to see you guys. We are back for episode 3 of the podcast.
Let's go.
And for today, we got one where we're going to kind of talk about the life of being a PK. If you don't know what that is, that's being a pastor's kid, being a kid that grew up in a household where your parents were pastors or in the ministry, or, some people have evangelists as parents or missionaries. And so we're going to kind of talk about that because that's not everyone's experience. And so I'll just kind of pull back the curtain and kind of show you guys like what was that like? What did that look like? Were there expectations? Were there, anything behind the scenes, that would happen in the house of a pastor or of a missionary or evangelist, or, you fill in the blank. Because I think people are always interested, like you see the pastors or you see the ministers on stage or online, and, it's one image on the stage. And I think everyone wonders for each person that they hear or listen to, it's like, I wonder how they're like if you actually meet them in person, or what are they like behind closed doors. And so that's kind of what we're going to talk about today.
I think it's a real interesting topic because, like you said, I think behind the scenes, people sometimes I think wonder, like, I wonder what Pastor Danny is like as a father. I wonder what he's like as a husband, that type of thing. And, and I wonder what he's like, as far as, in meetings and how he functions versus just what I see on a Sunday morning, him, preaching in his suits on a Sunday morning and praying for people. Like, is he that way, like, all the time, and that kind of thing? As a matter of fact, I just got off a phone call with a young lady, and I've been wanting her to come in so I could get to know her a little bit. She's like, I've been real hesitant to, to make an appointment with you. And so, it's sometimes, people like, man, I can't wait to get to know the pastor. Yeah. And then there's some people like are just hesitant because they're like, I don't know, like if I want to tell him a lot about myself and like, how is he going to act and how is he going to respond to what I have to say? And, and so some people I think are just not sure, but when it comes to, raising children, I think it's like every other home. I mean, there's rules and there's expectations and boundaries and that kind of thing. But this is going to be the uncut version of Pastor DJ's childhood in a pastor's home. So let's start with here. So at a young age, you realized that I was a pastor. And it was different than maybe some of your friends. I'll never forget when you and Bianca came home from school one day. And I think Bianca might have said it, but, you were able to agree that a lot of the kids in her class, she said, a lot of their parents are not even married. And she's like, I'm not even sure anybody in my class has parents that are married. And I was like, what? And so, then whether you're a doctor or a lawyer or a carpenter or whatever you do for your career and your living, I'm sure hours vary and experiences vary and so forth. So what was it like to be a pastor's son?
I would say, so honestly, it's kind of in one breath, to me at least, it was a boring answer in the sense of it's not. Growing up, I didn't really think of it as a disadvantage or as advantage. Like, I just kind of, I knew it was, and I was a kid that did enjoy church. I enjoyed going to the services. I made good friends when I was in kids ministry, and even then, as I got a little older into like my teenage years, I always enjoyed youth group. I always enjoyed all the events, and I was kind of all about that. I enjoyed it, and because for me specifically too, it's kind of naturally what happened. I didn't really try this, but even as I was in school, I built my full like social life more in the church rather than in school. That's very uncommon, even for people who are Christians. Like, when you're growing up in the school system, you have your best friends at school, you have your best friends in your sports teams, and even my siblings, they always would say, "Oh, can I hang out with this friend from school? Can I hang out with that friend from school?" And you guys could probably remember, like, or not remember, or, whatever you want to say. I never really looked to hang out with
Yeah.
people from school. I got all of my kind of like social battery, or, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
I kind of got all of that from church. So, and so obviously a big part of that is because, well, I grew up in the church. And so I lived the majority of my life at church, at least, at the bare minimum, 3 days a week, maybe. Even growing up, I didn't go to full-time kindergarten. I remember that. I went to they offered half day kindergarten. And so I would go to work with you guys at the church every morning. And then I did, I think, the second half of kindergarten, like the second half of the day. So at that point in my life, I was at church every day. But yeah.
Yeah, and then we had a daycare in those years. And so I remember you and Bianca were involved in that.
Yeah, I stayed at the daycare. Now, that was only for a few years. Maybe I was in the range of 10, 11, 12, but it wasn't for too long, at least from what I can remember. And that was just over the summertime. Yeah.
And I think too, when I was around, if I was going to the church, just to pick up something or just to do something, or if I knew that I was only going to be an hour or whatever, a lot of times I'd say, you want to, ride with me. It wasn't just coming to church, for services, but church became like a second home.
Yeah.
And so I remember, you guys would come to church, especially you being the older one. You would come with me a lot and take rides with me and that kind of thing. I remember in the day, sometimes you would travel with me, if there was traveling. And so that was cool. But so did the conversation ever come up in school? So what does your dad do and things like that? Did any of that type of conversation come up?
I imagine it did. And my personality was, I still am. I'm very indifferent when it comes to things that come my way, in the sense of I don't put a lot of weight on it. I'm not oh, I'm going to remember this forever, or this is going to impact me forever. That's just really not the type of person I am. So I can imagine it did come up, but I know, for example, my sister, when that conversation came up, she would always make it a point that she hated that conversation. She thought it was embarrassing. She thought, people were going to treat her different. And I just didn't see it like that at all. And so, yeah, it probably did come up, but I just remember it was not a sense of oh, I didn't care, but I wasn't ashamed of it, or I wasn't this is a weird, or this is a very unusual job, or I didn't really care about that kind of stuff.
Right. It was so funny because, your way of, I guess, dealing with it or handling it was very different, than Bianca. I remember one time Bianca came home from school and she said something like, I wish you were like a carpenter, or something like
or
that.
Or construction worker.
Yeah, construction worker. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she says, I can picture you with a T-shirt and jeans and a tool belt.
Yeah.
She said, I can picture you with a tool belt. And she says, you look more like a construction worker than you do a pastor, whatever. So, and I said, DJ, how do you feel about that? And you're like, no, I'm fine about it. I think it's good that you're a pastor, and I think you should stay a pastor, or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's just so funny. And that's the different dynamic. It would be real cool to have all the kids on set and have this discussion so that we could see the differences of opinions between all the kids. But as far as you were concerned, I remember even at a young age when I would be praying for people at the altar, I remember, I would ask you to come with me and pray, with an individual with me. I remember we did that on several occasions, and I always tried to include you as best as I could, and all the kids at the appropriate age, so that you could not only see from afar what I was doing, but I wanted you to be involved with what I was doing, so that you could also see that God can use you too.
Yeah. I think the one thing that a lot of people wonder about or think about is when it comes to, are there expectations, or are there, this added pressure, especially at least maybe not at school, but more so within the church, amongst your colleagues, your peers, other kids, other students, and then even the adults, kind of, is there a pressure, or is there an expectation when simply, you're the child of someone who is in ministry, and so, one thing about that is I would say, I would be lying to say if that like there is no added expectation. I think
Yeah.
that comes with it,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's one thing that maybe from a young age you didn't recognize it much, but then there were certain conversations that I would remember, growing up, whether it was, I remember I was I was a picky eater, right? And so typically, it depends on the personality of the parent, but some parents like, oh, no, you have to eat this, or other parents would say, who cares, whatever, I'll just give them whatever they want.
Right.
And for us, we were invited to a lot of people's houses, and we would, be hosted by families, and they would open their homes to us and they'd feed us a meal. And with us being a diverse church, we'd have a lot of different ethnic groups
Yeah.
and cultures. And so with that came different cuisines and foods and tastes and all that.
Yeah.
And so, a typical, I think like a 5-year-old, or not, I wasn't 5, but maybe I was like 10 or something like that. But typically a conversation between like two families would be like, hey, I have kids that might be picky, so, maybe could we have this or that instead, or, but for us, because, we were a family ministry, pastors, you guys, you and mom, you guys kind of, of course, like you're so thankful and grateful for anyone that would invite you into their home and, be very hospitable. And so this was, I remember, like an Indian family.
Yeah.
And so they made us authentic Indian food, which a lot of it was good. But I remember leading up to that day, we were sat down like as a family, like, like a family meeting, and hey, DJ, I know you're picky, but like you have to eat this because, you taught us the whole thing of,
being
honor,
thankful.
respect, being thankful. And, that was a conversation like that I just remember like randomly. But because, now I know, let's say if I would have thrown a tantrum,
Yeah.
or I would have gone upset, or I would have spit out the food in front of the family. Like, let's say I did that as a kid. We mentioned it last week when we were talking about like the roles and the expectations of the household, but for leaders in the church, it does say like to have the ability to lead your family, to have like good, upright kids, all that, because then it says if you can't lead a family, how can you lead a church? Mm-hmm. And so there is kind of like that dynamic of like really making sure that even the kids matter in a ministry home, because if the kids even aren't fully on board, that can even still hurt,
Sure.
So it's like with the pastor, it's like the spouse, of course, like that's like the given. The spouse has to be on board. And then to a lesser degree, it's like the kids almost in a way, because kids can't tell a parent what to do.
Right.
But in a way, if you want it to work, if it's going to work and, it's going to be healthy and run smoothly and well, the kids, in a sense, have to also be on board about it as well.
Sure. Yeah, that is a different dynamic, I know there's a lot of families who they leave it up to their kids if they're going to come to church or not.
Yeah.
But we never did that. And I would like to think that even if we weren't pastors, but we were just attending a local church and we were faithful to a local church and we were volunteering or involved in a church, that we still would have made our children come to church. But I know that that was something that in our house was kind of an absolute that, all the kids are going to come to church every time we're there with no exceptions, even we wouldn't allow sports to get in the way or anything. And so we were pretty strict with that. But I would like to think that even if we weren't pastors, that would still be the same case. But yeah, I think there was an expectation. And I think a lot of times it's an unspoken expectation. I think there, because no one really says, no one ever said to me or mom, like, hey, now your kid's got to be well behaved because you're the pastor. Like, no one's ever said that.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of like an unspoken thing.
Yeah.
But I think it is also an unspoken pressure. And depending on the personality, like you versus Bianca or Elisha, I think because you're different personalities, so you viewed things differently. But I think that there also is this unspoken pressure of that, you have to live a certain way, you have to be a certain way, hold yourself a certain way. And, never complain and not like get in trouble or not act up or whatever, because then, that puts like a bad name on the parents and that kind of thing. Nothing like that was ever said, but I think we just did our best to raise you guys as well as we could so that those things would naturally not be a problem. But again, every kid is different. So, but no, you were the first child, obviously.
Yeah.
You're the oldest, and so you were very compliant. You kind of went with it. You went with the rhythm of life and the rhythm of ministry. You kind of you never bucked it, and you just kind of went with it. And so that was very easy, especially being our first child. That made it very easy even early on as being, parents and pastors. You made it very easy, and you were a good example to the other kids as well. But yeah, like you alluded to before, I mean, you loved coming to church. I'll never forget, like I might be exaggerating a little bit, but like not only did you want to come to church, but it seemed like you wanted to be at least 30 minutes to an hour early.
Oh, yeah. I would say it wasn't for that much of a spiritual reason. A lot of times, I liked being at church for, obviously the services, but being early a lot of times was like to play basketball.
Yeah.
Because, we're blessed to have a gym at our church with hoops and all that. And so I remember I would want to be early, 20, 30 minutes early for youth and stuff because, we had the gyms open and, and back then too, our youth group had a lot of like hoopers, a lot of basketball players and stuff. And so that was kind of like one of the big things that we did. And so,
but it was so funny because like I would always like mess with you. Like I don't feel like bringing you back to church because youth was, Sunday nights. Yeah. And so if mommy and I didn't have any other commitment, we would technically have Sunday night off to just sleep or just watch a movie or chill or whatever. And so you would always be like, okay, you got to bring me to youth. You got to bring me to youth. So, and we live, a good 15, 20 minutes, depending on traffic, away, which is not that far. Just the back and forth of it.
We had church from, figure 9:30 until 1, and then you get home by 1:30, and then, you eat lunch. So then you're finally kind of chilling by maybe 2:30. And then before you know it, like 2-3 hours later, it's time to turn around and drive back. So.
Yeah, like 5 o'clock, you start saying, okay, don't forget, you got to bring me up, So, but you were always the one that, even pushed us. And I probably shouldn't admit this, but, there were probably times when I would have probably let you stay home, from youth. And because a lot of people don't realize this, but I'm pretty chill. Like I'm pretty naturally like chill. I'm not as uptight as some people might think because they see me very passionate on Sunday mornings and very excitable and passionate about things of God. And I am, but I'm also chill as well, and really the only thing I get really excited about is the Word of God and preaching and ministering to people and things of God. But everything else I'm pretty chill with. But there was times when I thought, DJ, you don't want to stay home? You don't want to watch this football game? Like stay home and watch this football game with me or, whatever, basketball game, whatever. You're like, no, I got to go to church. But, it'll still be on, when I get back or whatever the case would be. So like, there was many days where I probably tried to talk you out of going to youth, but you just loved, going to. So being a PK, in my opinion, I don't think it affected you at all. I think you liked it, or at the least, you're just indifferent.
Yeah. Well, I think it's all what you make of it too. I think a lot of the times, a lot of PK, there's like that running joke. It's like, PKs are the worst kids.
Yeah.
And I think, but it has nothing to do with because of the career that their parents are in. It's, more so because, there's certain personalities or certain people that, what they hear, what they're taught, or what is presented to them might not be enough. And then it feels like, well, I'm being hidden from something, or something's being hidden from me. And, like 95% of what we go through is because we did something. Like a lot of, in the sense of, typically a PK, your typical thing is like parents make you go to church, all the rules and stuff, and that's how you look at it as a kid. And then you don't, you get to a point in school where, you're living by those rules, but then you realize those rules are the minority in the world.
Right.
And then you're making these friends, and the friends are going, well, why do you live by those rules? And why do you do that? Come on, you know, that's kind of lame. And so then typically, you know, we're, as humans in general, we typically go with the crowd. That's our natural reaction.
Yeah.
So then you go with the crowd and you decide to divert and kind of, you know, kind of like the prodigal son. You kind of decide to go away from the way
Sure.
it should be. And then you do your own thing. You make your own decisions, which usually lead to more harm than good. Then, because at the end of the day, that PK always knew the truth, typically, not all the times, but the prayer is that there is then this prodigal son or daughter returning moment of, you know, they realized, you know, this was the right way. This is the truth. This is the gospel. And so just the difference with me was, you know, I took it and I kind of believed, you know, I didn't have to like question and, you know, I didn't have to, you know, try everything under the sun, you know, and that's a part of my testimony in the sense of, you know, I never did anything like tragic or terrible or things that would set me up for failure. And I remember for a while, you know, because growing up in church and being around the church and being around people where you hear these testimonies of like, you know, I used to be addicted to this and God set me free, or I used to be involved with crime and now I'm set free, or I used to be, you know, so fearful and now I'm free, or, you know, whatever it was. I just didn't have a story like that, which, you know, for a long time I thought that was like, you know, lame, or I thought that was, you know, like not effective or not impactful. But, you know, as I grew up, I kind of learned, you know, that is a special testimony in the sense of that God did protect me from a lot of the hurt or pain or decisions that, you know, more people than not commit, you know.
Sure.
And so that was kind of a big, you know, thing in my life, just kind of like finding because a lot of times people find their identity when they come to know Christ. But there is a section of my life where I felt like I had no before Christ era, you know, or I never even had a post Christ era. Like, and so I really didn't know in the sense of like my identity in the sense of I was broken, but now I'm like back together, or I was lost and now I'm found, like, you know, and so, you know, and it was like, that's a good problem to have, but still at the end of the day, and I had passions and desires to like help people and to like make an impact. A lot of the times because of my testimony, a lot of people kind of look down on me in that sense, like, oh, you didn't experience anything, you don't know what it's like to go through this or to go through that, or you grew up in church, or you don't understand, you know, the perspective of someone who's not a Christian, or you don't understand the perspective. So for a while that was kind of a challenge, because then I'm like, well, what do you do? I'm not going to just like start sinning just for the sake of it to say I did, you know. And so kind of finding this part of me of like, even because like I said, I felt like I was saved for as long as I can remember.
Sure.
And so finding my identity in which it was different than like my actions. So, you know, a lot of times like you find your identity as like, oh, I'm a good person, I did good things. But, you know, sometimes people then, you know, our actions change every day. And so if your identity is based off of what you do, you get stuck sometimes, or you feel repetitive, or you kind of feel like you're stuck in this loop. And so, you know, then kind of as I grew older, kind of finding my identity in the senses of, you know, I'm strong, I'm courageous, I'm obedient, I'm selfless. So, you know, the fruits of the Spirit, you know, you kind of find it within the fruits of the Spirit rather than what you did or what you're doing or what you've become. You know?
Yeah, I mean, you have a very unique story that unfortunately these days you don't really hear too much of. But at the same time, I think your story is one of the greatest, you know, testimonies of all time, that not only did God save you, but God kept you from sin. And I think we used to joke around a little bit when you were younger, is that because you were around me a lot. And so you would hear me preach, or you would hear me tell stories. You would hear me talk about my testimony and about things that I was involved in or whatever. I remember you kind of jokingly said, like, well, I never wanted not to be a Christian because you taught me what not to do by your testimony. And so I knew I didn't want that. So I just decided, well, I'm going to do everything opposite that you did, type thing. And I think in a sense, that was probably one of the smartest things you've ever done, is knowing that I don't have to do bad things to have a testimony, but the greatest testimony is, serving God and allowing God to lead you and so forth. I'll never forget, I asked you one day, I was like, so DJ, tell me, like, what is the worst thing that you've ever done? Like, I want to know. And so, I don't know. Every once in a while, I would call family meetings, at the house. And so I was like, come on, everybody, come to the living room. We're going to have a family meeting. And so, like, nobody would ever know what the family meeting was going to be about. We're going to talk about something. Come on, family meeting. So everybody would come. And so then, one day I was like, tell me, what's the worst thing that you ever did? And we were just talking about, like how God's been faithful and testimonies and things. And so, Bianca went on and on about, like, what she did wrong and the regrets that she had. And then I think we went to Boo and, we asked, so what were some of the bad things, whatever. And so we're just talking, and because me and Mom always wanted to be as transparent as possible. And we always wanted to be very open, with you guys. And we wanted to create a safe space, even for the siblings, to come together and just to talk openly about things. So we got to you, and I was like, so DJ, what did you tell everybody wants to know? And like, so we're all sitting in the living room, me, Mom, and the kids, we're all sitting in the living room around the couches. And so now all the attention and all the focus is on you. So I'm saying, so tell me, what's the worst thing? Everybody wants to know, DJ, what's the worst thing you've done? And so you're just kind of silent, and you're thinking. And I'm like, DJ, there has to be something. There has to be something. And I'll never forget, you were like, I got something. And everyone's like, yes, he's got something. And we're like, what, DJ? What did you do, D? Yeah. Like, and so it was like this big buildup. It was this big buildup. And you were like, well, there was one day when the cross country team, we were practicing, and we were running through, some fields, and we were running through the apple orchards, and you were like, and some of the kids started, picking up apples and putting them in their shirts, and they were running. And so I said, so what did you do? And you were like, so I did the same thing. I picked up apples. And so I said, you stole apples
from the orchards? Yeah. Long story short, I was part cross. Well, actually, it was during the track season, if I'm not mistaken. And during the track season, that was when apples would start to grow. That was like the apple picking season. And I got to a certain speed, because this journey was one that if you were slow, you would not have made it. Because practice, you're only there for an hour. And so we did like, I forget exactly how far the run was, but it was like a 6, 7, 8 mile run. Not two, but like in total. And I remember I'm stretching, I'm getting ready for practice, because our practice was pretty much, hey, go run and come back. Like, it was very simple. It wasn't too much. And so
runner's practice.
Yeah.
What do we do? Run.
Yeah, that's all it is. It's nothing too fancy. And so I'm stretching, and so some of the fast guys, they come up to me. They're like, hey, they're all talking. They're like, you think he's fast enough? And they're like, yeah, I think he's fast enough. So I'm like, what are you guys talking about? They're like, we think you can make it on like a top secret, journey that we're doing. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, cool. Like, let's do it. That sounds fun. So they're like, yeah, we're going to go to the orchards. And I was like, oh, wow, yeah, that's pretty far, because I knew where the orchards were. But they had this whole trail where it's like you went into some random part of the woods, and it was like this crazy, little mountain that you had to literally climb up. There was actually a rope there that you had to like mountain climb kind of up. It was maybe like 10 feet. It wasn't crazy, but just in the adrenaline of the moment, you're like, yo, this is crazy. And so, we're running fast, we're going through the woods. And so, we're still working out. So, at this point, I'm like, this is fine, whatever. We're still working out. And so then we get to the top, and we enter like the very back of the orchards. And they're like, yeah, here, let's just grab some apples or whatever. And like in the moment, I could have probably thought, I was like, wait, aren't these like, not right? But I remember thinking, I was like, well, I'll just pick up the ones that fell off the trees already. So, I'm doing, but as we're doing that, a huge like tractor, like a farmer's tractor thing, like it is like the huge ones that you see in the road that take up like a lane and a half, that you could probably drive under, like one of those. They're all like, head to the woods, because they're like, we can't be seen or whatever. So, all I knew is I was fast. So I started running away, and so we took off our shirts and we had like 2 or 3 apples. We created like a bag out of our shirts, and honestly, is one of those things that where I think our coaches probably knew. It's just they didn't really care, to be honest, because like we leave with shirts on, we come back shirtless with like something in. So I'm like, they had to have known. Yeah. I just don't think they probably cared, to be honest. Sure. So I remember, so I was like, when we had that family meeting, you're like, oh, what's something you've done wrong? I was just thinking. I was like, well, technically, I think this is not good. I stole, and, I probably shouldn't have done that.
And everyone's like, you stole? What did you steal?
Yeah. So, had to repent, shine the light onto it. But yeah, I think, that's one of the big things, that it's just what I figured out very early in life, for whatever reason, is just like, I hate drama. I hate, like, I always say, like, well, actually, the Bible says it before I do, but like, Jesus literally says, like, today has enough troubles on its own, and so he talks about that in the sense of not worrying about tomorrow. But also, when I read that, it's like life in itself can be challenging enough. And I'm a very like just logical A to B kind of guy. So I'm like, if today's already going to be challenging in some scenarios, like, why would I knowingly choose to do things that I either have to hide, cover up, or that just have consequences, or that have repercussions, or have bad effects, or could make me sick, or could make me unhealthy, or whatever it was. So I just very A to B. Like, it wasn't, honestly, like in my younger years, it wasn't something necessarily like holy, like I'm trying to be like Jesus.
Right.
Like, obviously that was a part of it, but also I just didn't find, which, I'm thankful for, because a lot of times you find desires and pleasures in doing what's wrong. For me, I wanted just a simple, and I was a very busy person too, in school. So like I had sports, I had, I was in all the honors and AP classes. And so I was busy. I stayed busy, and I kept busy. And so I was like, last thing I want is just to make my life harder, and what made my life harder is if I, decided to do dumb stuff.
It's funny when you talk about even some of the attributes of being a PK, or some of the things that PK kids go through that the average kids don't go through. What comes to my mind is working at the church. So I think about even today, like, if, let's say, there's somebody calls off on media, then I'll say automatically, Boo, like, I need you to do media, whatever. And so Boo wasn't scheduled. He wasn't planning on doing it. But just because he's my kid, like a lot of times it's a go-to, hey, Boo, I need this spot filled. I need you to do that. And so I think of you, and I remember, what year was it when we started doing filming?
Probably around 2018, I would say.
So we started doing video and started going live with our services. I'll never forget, like, I wanted to go live with our services, but I didn't have anybody to run cameras and things. And so I started getting you involved. And I can't remember, I don't know if this is clear to your memory, but when I started doing, like, back in those days, I did Wednesday's Word with Pastor Danny. And like Pastor Renee sometimes used to record me, and I think you used to record me too. Yeah. Sometimes with Wednesday's Word.
And honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, I think it was a little earlier. Like, I think it was 2016, honestly. Yeah, it was probably more, because I was definitely like a upperclassman in high school. It was probably around 2016.
Maybe a junior.
Yeah, so I was probably in like 10th, 11th grade. Yeah, and then, just kind of helping out. But then 2018, why I said that, because then I was hired at the church as like the social media manager. And so, I was in charge of like, website, social media posts, live streams and recordings and all that kind of stuff. Anything that had to do with social media, posting, video, pictures, that's what I was in charge of.
And I remember because we didn't have anybody to do it. And so we started doing it, and so you said, that you would do it or whatever. I'm not sure if you volunteered or we kind of, had you do it, but you were doing a good job. You were doing such a good job that you were like, okay, I mean, let's hire him, or give him a stipend or whatever, for doing this. And you did such a good job. So I think just in those things, like I think PKs find themselves in those, type of positions.
Yeah.
But it seemed like, you enjoyed it.
Yeah. And, naturally I'm a problem solver, and so when you work with people or work for people and you're in a setting where, in a church, you don't want just perfect people, you're kind of like a hospital for those who are lost,
Sure.
Spiritually. And so, yeah, you do come to face with people that do have situations and problems and scenarios that they need solutions for, that they're trying to figure out. And so naturally, I was always a problem solver, a peacemaker, kind of to keep, to try to regain order, to make things right. And so that included, even if there were like gaps or needs in the church, I would, whether teach myself or learn or just like volunteer to do something to fill a need or to, solve a problem. So whether that, because before I was ever hired or anything, all throughout my teenage years, when I was 13, 14, 15, and so on, I helped in kids ministry. I helped with the social media, and so I stayed busy, in that regard. And then, you grow and you perfect what you do. You find your craft, Bible says in everything you do, do it well, and so that's in anything, if you're helping with the kids ministry, if you're helping with social media, if you're helping with cameras, if you're helping with, the food ministry, whatever it is. And so, yeah, I just kind of naturally, I've always been a problem solver, even to this day.
I think too, because I was gone, I felt like I was gone a lot from the home. I tried to use every opportunity to include and your siblings. Like, so if let's say I was coming to church on a Saturday to give away food or whatever, like I would want you guys to come and be a part of that.
Yeah.
So number one, you're a part of it, but number two, I'm with you and we're doing it together type thing, instead of me just leaving the house and you guys being home. But I tried to include you guys because I was very aware that there was a lot of time out of the home. And maybe you could talk about that a little bit. I think that's something that, a lot of people struggle with. I think a lot of PKs struggle with that, or, even other kids where their parents are in high demand doing different things. How because we've had this conversation a lot through the years, and I've had this conversation with your siblings as well. But there was a season of when I was traveling or when I was newly a senior pastor, there was a lot of time out of the house. And I remember Mom did a really good job, like with you guys and explaining things to you. But how did you, because some people really struggle with that. People like, I've talked to PKs where they said, you were never around and blah, blah, blah. And so, and then that's when they decided to get into rebellion, know, and things like that. And, or they said they felt like rejected or abandoned, because you just weren't here. And it was like we were raised in a single parent home. And, so I've talked to PKs that, have that story and felt that way. So maybe you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, this is just kind of my mindset, my personality. So like, and I didn't have this maybe revelation when I was young, but there was a level of like understanding, and like I saw things very clearly, and I didn't allow like my thoughts or my emotions to like distort what was actually happening. Because, at the end of the day, it might sound harsh, but it's like people or kids will only have trouble with, a father or a mother being absent due to ministry if they don't know the importance of the ministry, or if they also just don't understand like the importance of like the work that has to be done, or the importance of following Christ, the importance of doing or being obedient to what Christ, would want to do. I've been doing a little studying on like Abraham and Isaac. I talk about childhood trauma.
Yeah.
Talk about, your father, as close to ministry as we could say it was. Abraham was in a ministerial role. He was a man of God.
Sure.
And, he's being obedient to God. God tells him to literally sacrifice Isaac. When you study the story a lot of times in Sunday school, you kind of make Isaac look like you. So like, oh, he was like a 10-year-old, But when you actually research it, the bare minimum age he was 18. They say he could have been anywhere between 18 and 30 years old. So now because you remind yourself, he was the one that carried up all the wood. So he had to be strong enough. He had to be big enough. He had to be, and so he's there. And then obviously this is, let's just say an 18-year-old. That's the youngest he possibly could have been. An 18-year-old versus a 100-plus-year-old Abraham. Isaac could have resisted. Sure. Isaac could have bucked it. Sure. Isaac could have, said no and fought Abraham. But there was a level of he had to understand and trust his father. Like I bet you Isaac was the one that laid himself onto the altar. Abraham probably didn't pick him up and force him down. Isaac was the one who actually laid himself onto the altar. And so all that to say, there has to be an understanding or a reverence or an acknowledgement of like, my dad's not leaving the house and he's not gone for 2 nights at the club. He's not gone for 2 nights, doing whatever he wants, or he's gambling, or he's, or he's just taking a break from the family. No, like, you look at it as families who have parents in the services, like in the Army or in the Navy, right? The kid understands, like, your dad is a hero, your mom is a hero. They're fighting for our freedom. They're fighting, for our country. Yeah. And of course, yes, like it's sad to see a parent gone for that long. And of course, you miss them. And but at the end of the day, especially with those in the services, like there's an understanding, like, oh, they're serving our country. That's the highest honor, The church, I'll say the church people, like, they're okay with that. That makes sense to them. But then what I don't like is when, yes, do parents in general have to be there for their kids? Of course. But then you would have to say that then for the people who serve in the Army, oh, they're not there for the kids. We know that's not true. Obviously, they love their kids. That doesn't mean they're a bad father or a bad mother. But, they have a very high responsibility. They're actually doing something that's honorable. And for some reason, there was like this stigma around like hardworking pastors who are trying to build a church, pour into a congregation. And so, they might be gone for, they might be coming home late at night, or they might have to go travel, for 2 or 3 days. And so then even within the church, there's this stigma around pastors, not being around the home much, which once again, yes, they need to be good fathers. They need to raise their kids. But, it's like very one-sided. We're talking about this is the work of God. This is God's house. This is God's work. Actually, the Bible says to take care of his house before you take care of your own. And so, there's all these things. And so for me now, like, it made more sense. And I'm happy that it didn't affect me, because I do understand, like, there was good things being done. It was important work being done. You have to focus more on what they're doing rather than what they're not doing, right. Yes, sure, they're not here, but what they're doing is I need to understand and acknowledge that it's important. And I would actually be selfish to say that, what he's doing is not more important than just like taking me out for ice cream. Is there a time and place for that? Of course. I'm not saying, dad or whoever is a pastor, they need to be gone for 300 days out of the year. Know what I'm saying, but all things with balance. Because even in your busiest period of pastoring, in the sense of being out of the house, at least to my knowledge, I can't recall like a week that you were gone. Maybe it was like 2, and it was never that even necessarily you were not back home. It was just like we were young, so we were in bed by 9:00, and maybe you were getting home by 10:00. And so. And there's just a lot of factors that come into that. Yeah. But for me, it's like if you have no problem with, parents in the service, being out overseas and they're doing something honorable. And I agree. It's like you should never fight, your spouse or a husband or wife if they're doing something like that, or a doctor. Sometimes you get called overnight shifts, and you're doing something honorable, you're doing something important, and so it's
I
important
mean,
for the
even
spouse.
people that work second shift.
Yeah, sure.
What if people work second shift jobs or third shift jobs? So, I think, there's a lot of opportunity for a parent, to be pulled away from the house because of work. It's just, I think just a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on, ministry kids are getting neglected because the parents are not around and that kind of thing. And so I think, pastors got a bad rap for that for many years. I think, number one, I try to include you guys as much as possible. And then when I was home, I tried to make the best of it and be present. So if you can't be home a lot, make sure that when you are home, you're going to be present. And then I have to say, I think Mommy did a great job with supporting me. So in her support of me, she was able to communicate that to you guys. And then I remember Mom saying, like, sometimes people have jobs that take them away from the home or whatever, but they're, helping people and they're, supporting for their families and that kind of thing. So Mommy always had a really good attitude and a great perspective. And so I remember her like talking to you guys about that. And so, that obviously was a big help, but just making sure that when we were all together, that we made every moment count. And if I could include you, I would, So I remember there was in the earlier days, I remember we used to have like work days. I think it was like once a month around the church where we would like get rid of garbage and things. Yeah. And so like I would bring, you to like a work day or whatever. And so like I tried to include as much as possible. So I think that's good. But I think also, even in all of that, I think that you had a really mature perspective of it, even as a young child. I think somehow you had a very mature perspective of it, and you had a good grip of understanding, a healthy understanding. So obviously that was amazing as well. And some of that's just personality, and you're a very flexible, and you don't get offended easy, or you don't get hurt easily. And so, I think all of those things, kind of play into it. But so overall, your PK experience has been good.
Yeah, I would say, mine has been good. And I think too, arguably, being in a PK house, it's like you are if you take the tools, or if you use the tools that are given to you just naturally in the PK household, obviously bearing it's all done right and it's the true gospel that, your pastoral parent is preaching and like given all that, like you do kind of come out with an advantage, because at the end of the day you have this, it's kind of similar as growing up in just a Christian household. Like you should have this advantage in life in the sense of like, the truth very early on. And so then it's up to you, like, are you going to actually live by it or deny it, and so on. And so, I've always been very thankful for, being in a PK house, and it's a big part of, I think, it's aided me, or it's prepared me in a lot of ways to be in the position that I am today. I think innately, obviously I was called to ministry, and so I believe I would have been in this position whether I was a PK or not, because I think, once again, there were just some unexplainable attributes or personality traits that I had that truthfully is just what I simply need in general, just to be a good pastor, or just to be able to survive like in ministry, to not be offended easily, to not really care like what people think or what people say, or, to be kind of, indifferent when it comes to like opinions and stuff. Like I just kind of look to the Bible, and that's, very non-emotional in the sense of, it's easy to be led by your emotions, especially in a job that you're dealing with hundreds of other people's emotions. Like that's easy to, get lost in that sometimes.
Good or bad.
Yeah, good or bad, But I think, just innately, more to what being a PK has helped me with is like the practical stuff. Like, so I know what it looks like, from behind the scenes. And so I've, for me, I've been blessed by it, and it's been, beneficial. And, I know that's honestly probably like the minority of the experience, but I would challenge it's, for people to really think, once again, if it's because, yeah, their parents are just truthfully like bad people, like that has nothing to do
Sure.
with if they were a pastor or not. That more has to just do with their parent. Being a PK, or if your parent is a pastor and they do that correctly, according to the word of God, I'd argue if you had a bad experience, that was most likely self-brought. Or you misinterpreted, or you misunderstood, or you didn't quite understand what your parents did until it was almost like too late, until you kind of already formed some hurt or opinion bias, towards, their profession, towards, their calling.
I'll never forget, there was a pastor that worked here for a while, part-time. He was a retired pastor, and he was brought on as the pastoral care pastor. So he did a lot of visitation, hospitals and such. And his name was Pastor William Farrell. And he was probably in his early 80s when he started working with us. Just an incredible man, just so much wisdom and so much, of course, experience and things. But I'll never forget, one of the things he told me is the ministry is one of the highest callings that anybody could receive. And really I could honestly say I never really had that perspective. But I remember as a young guy, in ministry, and he would talk to me about ministry and the cost of serving Christ, and the cost of serving Jesus, and the cost of being a leader, and the cost of being in ministry, and all these things, and talking about the greatest honor and the greatest calling, and the church being the greatest institution ever. And it's like, so just listening to him talk, it really impacted me. And so for me, even like, let's say if I was home, or if I was traveling for a week, when I was an evangelist for several years, so I would be gone sometimes for a week or two. Like, I never thought like, man, like my kids are going to suffer because of this. Like, I always thought this is the greatest call of God, and to serve the greatest institution alive, the church of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so I think a lot of it's perspective.
Because there is a wave of like this kind of selfish, false humility thing going on, like even in the church world, of like, oh, well, being a pastor, it's, really not that big of a deal. I'm just like you. Like, they say the things that sound good, like, oh, I'm just like you, and, you can do it too, and I'm not special. And, it's things that like sound good and like inclusive and like nice.
Right.
But, there's a reason why there's high expectations for pastors. There's reasons why what pastors teach will be judged more harshly. There's reasons why, just, all ministers that you see in the Bible, like there was a balance of extreme honor and reverence, but then also, and there was a lot of benefit that came from that, and, the just being a part of what God's doing. But then also there is another side of ministry that's, that can include some suffering and some hardships and some, fights and some, just like struggle, because, you're the front lines of what God's trying to do, in your community, in your family. And so, I would agree in that sense. Like, that's what I always tell, whether it's even my, my wife, Emily, or, what I tell people who are also interested in like ministry. It's like, it's the greatest career you could ever have, like in the sense of impact, in the sense of call, in the sense of purpose, there's none that really comes second, when you are called to like work for the Lord firsthand, like that's a big deal.
And there's definitely sacrifice, like involved for sure. I know we're going to be wrapping up soon, and I just want to, point out two more things. I think when I think of you, I think of what was a very pivotal, in my opinion, a very pivotal season in your life was, I think you were a senior when you went to Africa with me, right? Were you a senior or a junior?
I was a senior. That was in 2017 that I went.
And I remember that was 27. So that was my first year. So my first year going to Nigeria was in 2002, and it was amazing. And then, got busy and years passed. And I remember I started getting invitations in like 2015 to come back. But, through prayer and so forth, I didn't feel like it was quite time. So then 2017 arrives, and now we're planning a trip. And, you had mentioned that, you would like to go. So if you can get out of school, what would we think about that? And so you were able to get out of school for it, and we went through a meeting and a whole thing. But that was like a very, very huge moment, not only for you, but I think for me. Going to Africa with you, or you coming to Africa with me, was huge, because I knew in my heart that something was about to shift, and there was a greater level, not only of Christianity, and relationship with Christ, but a greater level of your commitment to things of God and ministry. And even at that time, you weren't even planning at that time of being in full-time ministry. So tell me a little bit about that. So then when you were a senior in high school, went to Africa with us, and we were there for almost a month, 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks.
Yeah.
And then after that, kind of go into a little bit of what made you decide to be in full-time ministry.
Well, yeah, Africa was fun. I think if anything, Africa, at least for my first trip, for that first trip, I was still in school. I was still a student. I was still in classes. I still had all that. I think one of the first initial thoughts I had after the trip, for me, it definitely had an impact on the practical things in the sense of, being thankful for what you have, running water, hot water, good food, good transportation, good roads, good police force, good, like a healthy government, all this kind of stuff, because Nigeria lacks like all of that. Good school system, education systems, that is accessible, and that's all that stuff. And so you're thankful for those things. And so I always tell people, I recommend one third party or a third world country trip,
Sure.
Just go to one. And it doesn't have to be for 3 weeks or a month. Go for a week, and that could be a country in South America. That could really be any third world country. You'll get a similar feel out of that. When it came to spiritually, for that first trip, I did kind of take a back seat for a lot of things, just watching and being a part. But, the Nigerian culture, they loved, they honored so greatly. Even me,
Sure
despite me not really being like a pastor or being on stage or speaking, they actually thought it was very honorable and exciting that like you would bring your firstborn son to their country, so that alone. And so for me, I kind of felt the most, like, obviously the in-person experiences, like, you can't top that, and you can't, put a price on that. And it was, like, all amazing and life-changing and all that. But I think, like, coming back home was, in a way, just as impactful as being there, because you saw the night and day difference of, like, people's hunger and people's desire for the Lord and the things of God. And I think in a lot of ways that's actually what kind of like highlighted how I was different, or more different than I thought. Like obviously when you're a Christian alone, you're separate from the world. You are going to be different just by being a Christian, a follower of Christ. But I think then when I came home, I think I realized in some ways I was like I almost felt like this, like the world I came back to in America and the church and my school, like that was almost like very like not normal to me. Like I was like, something's off, like something's like weird about how people are here and how people think about church and how people treat pastors and how people treat the church, or how people deal with sin. And like I was like, something's way off with like how things are here. So I think it kind of highlighted more of a sense of like my sense of being set apart, and I didn't know what that was for. That could have just been me really just pursuing God, being, really trying to be like the best follower of Christ as I could be. It could have been that. But then also I really enjoyed sharing my experiences like in school, and, God opened doors of like, I would take over full classrooms and like just talking about what, I did in Africa and all that kind of stuff. So that was 2017 into 2018. 2018 of my senior year. And so leading up to the summer of 2018, I had plans to become a physical therapist, and I was interning at OSS, and I was kind of getting ready for that. And then I went to a summer camp in 2018 with the church, and that was when everything kind of got all pulled together in one moment of like a clear call from God, like like this is your life, like this is going to be your life mission. Long story short, it was just a moment where God clearly said, like, the love, because I was having kind of like, I was very emotional at the altar, and I didn't know why, because once again, that's just not my personality. Sure. So I'm just, God was clearly trying to tell me something. And so I pray, God, why do I feel this way? It wasn't a bad feeling. It was a good feeling. And I felt very emotional and just tears of joy and all this kind of stuff. Very grateful, very loved, all this. And so, I just remember God kind of saying, like, the same love that you feel now, it's going to be your job now to, present this to people, like, or it's going to be your job to be a carrier of this, to display this kind of love so that other people can have the opportunity to experience what you're going through. So that was kind of like right there and then it was like, all right, so this is it. And so, that was 2018 in the summer. And so I get ready to, do some sort of ministry school. So I did online BSSM. I did that in 2020 because that was all during COVID. And so I knew I wanted to be in ministry. I didn't jump into ministry right away because, like I said, 2018, I got a job at the church as the social media manager. So not really ministry related, but, I was in the church and, once again, doing my thing. And, I remember you guys trying to talk me out of ministry just to kind of like test me to see like if this was legit, or was I just doing this because this is all I knew, or that's because of what you did, and so on. And so, 2018 to 2020, I was a social media manager. And then in 2020, then I got the opportunity to become the kids pastor. And so then became the kids pastor, but then COVID happened. So then like literally a month into being a pastor, like the world shut down. And then I took that opportunity to go to the ministry school for a year online. 2023, I became also like the youth pastor. So I had both the kids and the youth ministry. And also in 2023 is when I got married.
Big year.
And then in 2024 is when finally, with doing both of those positions, I also inquired a third position of being over the young adults ministry. And so then at that point, it was fitting for me then to become full-time at the church. So that's what I've been doing then for the last year.
So it's been a year. So you've been full-time. Actually, this summer will be a year. July, I believe. July or August makes it a year.
Yeah, just about a year and a few months.
Wow. That's amazing, because you were part-time for several years, and then you became full-time last summer. And now you're the family pastor, oversees basically birth to the young 40, adult age. So like, so that's huge. And me and Mom were always of the mindset that we want the kids to do whatever God wants them to do. Yeah. We never wanted to get in the way of God's plan. And so if God was going to call one of the kids into ministry, great. If he wasn't, great. But whatever they would do it as unto the Lord with excellence, and they would be excellent at whatever they put their hands to, whatever they decide to do. So, but we never wanted to, make our kids feel like because we're in ministry, our kids had to be in ministry. Yeah. Because I just didn't want to do that. I didn't think that was fair or right. And I wanted each child to have their own encounter with God, their own experience with God. And I wanted each child to be led by the Lord concerning their spouse, concerning their futures and jobs and all that. And of course, I would give advice if asked and my opinion if asked. But I really didn't want to try to play Holy Spirit in this. I wanted God to do it because being a pastor and being your father, I probably didn't always master it, but I tried to not force anything. I tried to allow God to do his thing. That I could never be blamed. Well, you made me do this and you forced me into this, and I never want, so I never wanted to go that direction. And so, but I thought it was very, very cool because, like you said, you were going on the track of being physical therapy, and you always wanted to be like in sports medicine, and I thought that was great, and when you began to like share your dreams about that, then I kind of caught on to the dream as well, and I was really excited about that as well, providing physical therapy for professional athletes. And so I thought, man, let me try to do whatever I can to help you to reach those goals. Yeah. And I was really excited about it. So then when the script was turned upside down and you were like, man, I really feel now God's calling me to ministry, I just wanted you to make sure that it was God and that you didn't feel no pressure from me or Mom to be in ministry, but it was definitely something that God was calling you to. And so I don't know if it was a month or 2 months or whatever, we told you to fast and pray and really seek God on this. And so that was cool. And so I think it's amazing now where we are, so starting from, today we started on this podcast talking about as a child what it is to be a PK, a pastor's kid. So your experience was good for the most part, and now we find ourselves working together on the same team, which is really cool. Yeah. And it's a privilege and an honor to work with you because you do everything to the best of your ability, and it's an honor to watch you and to watch you grow. And to watch how people receive you is cool. And I just, I'm so proud of you. And I feel that, you're just continuing to grow. I mean, just even, I think it was today's Wednesday. So Monday night when you taught at prayer on Monday night, I was sitting in the back row and I was just, I was taking notes. I was trying to write down everything that you were saying. And it was just surreal that it's like, wow, you've come like a long way, and, your presentation has become really clear and you become confident and you were just flowing. And I was just so proud. It was like one of those proud moments. And I'm like, look at me taking notes now, like when DJ's teaching. And so I just thought it was so cool to see kind of the full circle. Yeah. And now that you're married and now your wife is, getting involved in the ministry with us. Yeah. And so it is just an honor. And I just thought it would be so cool because I remember on our first podcast, you interviewed me and asked me a little bit about my childhood, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of share what was it like to be a PK. And so thank you for sharing that.
Of course. Yeah. And, it's, working with family is like one of those things that people are unsure about, and it doesn't work for everyone. But, I think what is cool is that, we have, two different personalities, but I think, we do work well together, and, I think we're a good balance to one another. And, what I might be weak in, you're better at, and what you're weak in, I'm better at. And so I think it does actually more good even for the church, that we pastor at, because if people feel like if they sit under my teaching, they feel like they're lacking something, well, they know then they can get whatever they're looking for from you, and then vice versa as well, so it's kind of cool kind of seeing that, because it wasn't always like that at first when I first started, but, I'm starting to see also the shift of how people are receiving me, and certain people that enjoy maybe my style or whatever. And so it's cool being able to serve in that capacity, in the sense of, we both have something different to give, and both things are both equally as important. So it's giving our church members a more full, a
full diet,
just a feel, you'll get, if you want, your teaching, or if you want your preaching, if you want, altar calls, if you want Bible studies, if you want Hebrew to Greek breakdowns, if you want, just end time theology, everything. It's we kind of bring it all together, and, it helps the church get the full.
You definitely complement, the team here at Redemption, and it is a privilege to work with you. And now, Bianca's working with us part-time, and Boo, of course, is involved. He plays drums, but he also helps with media. He helps me with my social media, and he's going to be leaving in August to college, so we're going to miss him. But it's been a privilege to see the family come together and work
Yeah.
At redemption together. And it's been, I mean, there's some times when like the majority of our family's on the stage at the same time, or on the stage at some point throughout the service. And I don't take those things for granted.
Yeah.
I think it's a beautiful thing when you see the hand of God in it. So I'm very, very thankful, and I'm glad that you had a good PK experience.
Yeah.
Because a lot of PKs don't have that story. And if we talk to Bianca, Bianca has some different thoughts, concerning being a PK, and she found it a little bit more difficult at times, and different, more challenging at times. But everybody has their story, but I'm thankful that she's come around and she's doing well, and so I'm very thankful what God is doing in her life. But I'm also grateful that you had a good experience being a PK.
Yeah, well, this is going to be the end of episode 3. And so, I appreciate everyone who clicked on and watched. And, I pray to bless you, that you learned something, or you're able to get some insight and all that good stuff. And so make sure you are subscribed to the channel. If you are not, we're trying to get to 100 subs right now. As of the recording of this video, where I think we're at like 55 or 56. And so let's try to get to 100, share the podcast, and we come out with shorts almost every day. And so make sure you're sharing and liking and commenting on those shorts as well. And we will catch you guys on the next one. See you guys.
God bless you.